Hey nerds. So, I'm going to continue my deep dive. I'm going to do another deep dive philosophy video today, continuing my series on Habermas's book called The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. And yeah, before I get going, of course, please like, share, subscribe. More important than anything else, subscribe. And if you order literally anything at all on Amazon through the link for a book in the description of this video, I get a little kickback and no extra cost to you. And if you want to give me a tip on my Patreon page for each individual post without giving me a certain amount of money each month, that link is in the description as well. And you can give me any amount of money on Patreon per month if you want to. And please subscribe to my Rumble page as well, because that helps out me. That helps me out too. All right. So this book, Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, I'm going to do another philosophy deep dive on this today, and we're going to talk about Nietzsche, Hegel, and Habermas. Basically, so Habermas, of course, one of the 20th century members of the Frankfurt School, or an evil critical theorist, according to dumbass pseudo-intellectual crackpots like James Lindsay, who thinks that critical theory, critical race theory, Marxism, feminism, everything, like 18 other like woke studies or non-woke studies at all, like critical theory and mostly critical race theory. He thinks that basically the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School are demons because they spawned the evil postmodern neo-Marxism that Jordan Peterson, he doesn't usually that term anymore, but he does believe in the concept, which is a backwards, totally contradictory concept. But so anyway, I've talked about Habermas before. He was one of the critical theorists, along with there were a few other principal ones too, but we don't need to talk about them for the purposes of this video. And one of my favorite Hegelian / Lacanian / Marxist philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, he's talked about some critical theorists too, as we know. But anyway, so of course Hegel, he was a famous 18th century idealist philosopher, one of the most influential philosophers of all time. And of course, he had some very interesting views. For the purposes of this, we're getting into rationalism, modernity, time, and politics. So, and this supposed connection to Marxism too. So, of course, Hegel, he's talked about, he and Heidegger, well, Heidegger has talked about Hegel's work a lot, and I've gone into some of Heidegger's books too, and they don't really, like, neither of them really talk about politics as much. So this, like, political attachment is kind of applied to both of them posthumously. But anyway, he's going to reference Habermas is going to reference the young Hegelians here, and unlike what James Lindsay claims, the young Hegelians were not fucking Marxists, and Hegel himself was not a fucking Marxist. And as anyone with half a brain who's read anything about Marx knows, this historical materialism that Marx founded, and basically turned the supposed dialectic of Hegel on its head. It wasn't adopting Hegel; it was rejecting it explicitly. And of course, the discourse anyway, or not the discourse. The dialectic that Hegel is known for, he never actually used that term. It was applied to his work posthumously as well, but it's the opposite. So Marx turned that on its head, and it's the opposite of the dialectic in terms of historical materialism. Anyway, so we're going to get into Habermas's opinions on Hegel and Nietzsche. And of course, Nietzsche, as I've talked about it many times before, and countless people know who he is. He was an 18th and 19th century, I would say, like, existentialist philosopher who had really interesting thoughts on all kinds of subjects. And he, of course, famously went crazy and wound up in a mental institution near the end of his life. And of course, his sister edited his works posthumously to make them sound more favorable to Hitler, because she was a Nazi and he was not at all a Nazi, the complete opposite almost. And so that's why some people think that they're right-wing interpretations of Nietzsche, which are completely inaccurate, because Nietzsche would never have been a Nazi. And this was particularly in his last book called Will to Power, which he was writing when he died. But then she finished it and edited it posthumous and released it posthumously to make it sound more favorable to Hitler. And then Hitler used it in his speeches. That's relevant because we're going to talk about politics here. So we're going to talk basically in terms of politics. Habermas is talking about the young Hegelians versus the young conservatives in relation to Nietzsche, which again is inaccurate because Nietzsche was not a conservative. He wasn't a right-wing guy. He wasn't really a left-wing guy either. He was closer to being a left-wing guy than a right-wing guy. And Hegel was too. So we're talking about the young Hegelians. So they were more lefty, but contrary to what James Lindsay claims, they were not Marxist, and Hegel wasn't a Marxist, and they weren't critical race theorists or any shit like that. And so we're talking about the sort of left-wing young Hegelians versus right-wing young So left-wing young Hegelians and let's say right-wing young Nietzsche-style young conservatives. All right. I know it's complicated, but it's important to have the context to get into this. All right. So using a reduced concept of reason, the young Hegelians hold fast to Hegel's project. They want to conceive and to criticize a modernity divided within itself by way of a different dialectic of enlightenment. So basically, as I said, this idea of Hegel having a dialectic was actually applied to his work posthumously, as I said. But in terms of what people understand as the dialectic, there is an understanding of it. And so they're talking about that. And it's widely acknowledged among philosophers. So they're basically acknowledging that and using that working definition of it. So conceive and to criticize a modernity divided within itself by way of a different dialectic of enlightenment. So they're pointing out that this modern enlightenment era is divided against itself, not just on politics, but on, let's say, science too, which we're also going to get to, and morality and aesthetics in our culture too. But so they're changing the dialectic of enlightenment, and they're going to get into how they're going to do that. And so Habermas is explaining how they're going to do that. And they're only one of several parties. The other two parties involved in the debate over the correct understanding of modernity so basically he's going to get at contrasting understandings of modern Enlightenment culture between the left-wing young Hegelians and the right-wing Nietzschean conservatives. The other two parties involved in the debate over the correct understanding of modernity attempt to dissolve the internal connections between modernity, time consciousness, and rationality. So these are important concepts to go over too. So we're talking about the modern era, right, in terms of modernity and also modern culture. So this is in contrast to so-called postmodern culture, which is and like I said, the critical theorists have been inaccurately labeled as postmodernists or the demons behind the rise of postmodernists. But as I said countless times before, and anyone who's read these books knows this, they're commenting on the culture in modernity. They're commenting on modern culture. They're not saying like, oh, bring down modern Western culture. No, they're just analyzing various philosophical aspects of it. That's all it is. There's nothing threatening here. It's ridiculous when people like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay act like critical theory is a threat at all. It's not in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, so modernity, the modern era and modern culture. Time consciousness, basically just time and consciousness together. So basically these contrasting political views between left-wing young Hegelians and right-wing Nietzscheans with their ideologies, they dissolve connections between time, consciousness, and rationality in our modern era and culture. So basically, what Habermas is getting at is that time, consciousness, and rationality are inexorably connected in our modern era and modern culture. But if you want to have right wing or left wing views on this, then you're dissolving the connections between this, which is inaccurate, because in reality, time, consciousness, and rationality are essential aspects of the modern era and modern culture, which makes sense, right? Regardless of how not regardless, but depending on your definitions of time, consciousness, and rationality, which are, of course, widely contrasted throughout the history of philosophy by various philosophers, right? All right, so anyway, they attempt to dissolve the internal connections between modernity, time, consciousness, and rationality. By the same token, they cannot, so they're trapped in this mindset, right? By the same token, they cannot escape the conceptual constraints of this constellation. The party of neoconservatives stemming from right Hegelianism. Oh, he's not talking, sorry, I misspoke earlier. The young conservatives stemming from Nietzsche's interpretations, but they're also right-wing neoconservative Hegelians, which is another reason why Hegel was not a fucking Marxist. He wasn't a critical theorist. He wasn't a critical race theorist. Since he wasn't explicitly political very often at all, that's why there are left-wing young Hegelians and there are neoconservative Hegelians. So obviously, you can interpret a lot from his politics, and some of it is more accurate than others, because Hegel is probably more left-wing than right-wing, but he's not like explicitly left-wing. Anyway, so we're talking about so for simplicity, we're gonna say the left-wing Hegelians versus the right-wing Hegelians, because that includes Nietzsche too. All right, so the party of neoconservatives stemming from right Hegelianism yields uncritically to the rampaging dynamism of social modernity, inasmuch as it trivializes the modern consciousness of time and prunes reason back into understanding and rationality back into purposive rationality. Okay, so we'll get into this here. Okay, so basically, let's say the cultural trap of social modernity, as he was explaining there, which trivializes, as he's saying, modern consciousness of time. So it trivializes connections between time and consciousness, as he was getting at, right? Prunes in it, let's say it molds reason and understanding back into purposive rationality. So when you're having this right-wing, I think he's talking about the right-wing Hegelian interpretation in particular. So when you're trapped in this right-wing Hegelian political mindset, and that inevitably rather has to dissolve the connections in our modern culture between consciousness and time, and it molds rationality to just whatever purpose you want to use your rationality for. So it's not just rationality, it's right-wing politically biased rationality. In the same way, I think Habermas would say you can have left-wing Hegelian biased purpose of rationality. So really, it's not actually rational, right? You're using your intuitions to you're using rationality to retroactively justify your intuitions for the political worldviews that you're trapped in, whether it's right-wing Hegelianism and Nietzscheism or left-wing Hegelianism, right? All right, so aside from so again, not scientistically, as in scientism. Of course, there are many places for science, but it won't answer many questions in life. And this philosophy of scientism, or this like worship of science, as some militant atheists like Sam Harris do, they give science a bad name because science is very useful for things like health, like COVID, for example. Anyway, you can get ideologized by science and believe in it too much like Sam Harris, and think that science can answer all moral questions. Like, That's just fucking stupid. All right, so that's what he means by scientism. Let's say like an ideology of science. Aside from a scientifically independent science, cultural modernity loses any normative character for it. The party of so right-wing Hegelians, and he's about to get the Nietzschean young conservatives too. So the party of young conservatives, stemming from Nietzsche, outdoes the dialectical critique of the age. So remember, Habermas was saying that left-wing Hegelians turn Nietzsche's dialectic on its head, and then he's saying the right-wing Nietzscheans also turn the dialectic on its head, and they change. So basically, if you're trapped in a right-wing or political theology, right-wing or left-wing political ideology, you've turned the dialectic on its head to suit your intuitive explanations, biased explanations for things that you're retroactively rationalizing as rational. So basically, these are how we were trapped in a right-wing or left-wing ideologies in terms of interpretations of Hegel and Nietzsche. All right, so Nietzsche does the dialectical critique of the age inasmuch as it radicalizes the modern consciousness of time and unmasks reason as absolute purposive rationality as a form of depersonalized exercise of power. So this is what we're getting at, right? What he was getting at in terms of these ideologies is the power of these right-wing and left-wing ideologies that we get trapped in our modern Enlightenment culture. It's overall a simple point, but he's getting into the complexity of it, right? So whether you're talking about a right-wing or a left-wing turning of the dialectic on its head, regardless of whether you have a right-wing or a left-wing ideology, you're just using the power of purposive, idealistic rationality to retroactively justify your biased ideology, right? So basically, rationality is not all it's cracked up to be if you use it for your own personal ideology, right? So he's criticizing, obviously, this idea of going too far rationality and it becoming scientism, right? As if you can behave rationally. And of course, we know from moral foundations theory, people like Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson, that people do not behave rationally. We can attempt to, but we actually behave intuitively and retroactively justify our actions with rationality. So anyway, he's basically saying that we can rationalize our ideologies, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, in a nutshell. All right, so as a form of depersonalized exercise of power. At the same time, it owes to the aesthetically independent avant-garde those unacknowledged norms before which neither cultural nor social modernity can stand up. All right. So basically, he's also getting at the aesthetics of the norms in our modern culture. You could say like the way that people perform cultural rituals that can be influenced by different political ideologies. So basically, this is an interesting point, which is a simple point, but he kind of complexifies and makes more interesting, I think, as philosophers tend to do. So basically, what Habermas is getting at is whether you have a right-wing Hegelian a left-wing Hegelian or a right-wing Hegelian or right-wing Nietzschean ideological view of culture, you're trapped in this mangling of the dialectic that is unrealistic because it disconnects time from consciousness and rationality. And then these biased political ideologies, the power of these the power of these political ideologies are traps in the sense that we think we're being rational, but we're not being rational. So in a sense, if you're following a particular if you're devoted ideologically to a right-wing or left-wing political view, or you're ideologically committed to science and rationality, then this is a trap and you're not actually rational. You're behaving intuitively and using your supposed rational views to have a rational right-wing view or a rational left-wing view, because it can't be the case that both right-wingers and left-wingers are rational, right? It's ideology. It's not that neither are true. It's that, like I would say, that they're different. They're better solutions for better situations, and one political ideology is not always going to have the right solution for every problem. All right. So anyway, basically, as I said, what Habermas is getting at in a nutshell is that ideologies are powerful, and they caused us to political ideologies are powerful, and they cause us to be trapped in this mangling of the Enlightenment that makes it the case that we are basically deluded because we disconnect modern culture from time, consciousness, and rationality. So in our modern Western culture, we are trapped in political ideologies that delude us from being able to see the fact that our political ideologies are not rational. We're all extremely ideological. Deal with it.